My name's Colin Marshall. This is the Marketplace of Ideas. My guest is Angus Fletcher, Distinguished Professor Emeritus at the City University of New York Graduate School. In 2005, he was awarded the Truman Capote Prize in Literary Criticism, and in 2007 received a senior fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities. His new book, Time, Space, and Motion in the Age of Shakespeare, examines the interplay between early modern science, poetry, and drama. Angus, welcome to the Marketplace of Ideas.
Oh, it's delightful to talk to you, Colin.
Now,
I'm glad to be with you.
I'm going to start with two large, broad questions here about your book. When and where?
When and where?
Exactly, the setting, time-wise, and geographically of the works that you examine.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, the period that this book covers is mostly what we call the English Renaissance, so that this is the lifespan of Shakespeare. He was born in 1564, same date, same year as Christopher Marlowe, who really got Elizabethan theater going, and the same year as Galileo, who really is the founder of modern physical science. So they all share, those three share that birth date, that year of 1564. So it goes right up through towards the end of the 17th century, where I end with comments with a chapter on Milton's Paradise Lost. So that's really covering almost a little bit more than 100 years. That's the period covered. And, of course, mostly the literature itself is English. Christopher Marlowe, the story of Dr. Faustus, which is, of course, the founding story of modern thought, according to Spengler and so many other thinkers, so that we speak of the modern period as a Faustian period. That was Christopher Marlowe's great tragedy, the tragedy of Dr. Faustus, and then that spread to Goethe and everywhere in Europe, and it's right into the modern period. And then, of course, I deal with Shakespeare. I have a considerable chapter on Shakespeare. Ben Jonson, who was his rival. Then I deal with John Donne, the great metaphysical poet, and I finally conclude with Milton. But in between, there are other authors. They're mostly English. And then on the other side of the continent, my hero is Galileo, who, of course, is Italian and corresponds with all the great scientists in Europe that he can reach. So it's quite a wide range of where as well as when.
Of the artists that you listed, why them?
I don't know if this is the fashion these days, but they really are the greatest poets of our literature before perhaps the 19th century. I would say that those great poets are without parallel. One can deal with lesser works than those of Shakespeare, but they remain more illuminating on complex issues than the works of the lesser poets. In fact, I guess that's why we think of him as such an extraordinary thinker as well as poet. These are canonical poets in a sense, but for me, I chose them because they're directly concerned with my major theme in this book. You see, Colin, the thing is that they have an independent existence in teaching and in our history. Readers have always gone back to them. Readers to this day take great delight when they read John Donne's lyrics, for example. But these poets are all concerned directly with the abiding and fundamental question that I'm raising, which is the new theory of motion, which starts modern science in the midst of the high point of Shakespeare's career, for example.
The new theory of motion, then, when do you pinpoint that as having an effect that starts rippling through the world of poetry and drama?
There's a little bit of difficulty here. Galileo, as I say, is the central scientific figure for me, and I mean, I'm just following historians of science in this regard. It's not an invention of my own to say that. One historian of science said that Galileo is our favorite scientific hero, and I like that, and that's justly said. But this ripple effect is very difficult to pinpoint. For example, some people have said that if you look closely at Shakespeare's sonnets and if you look closely at Hamlet, you will see vague allusions to disturbances in the heavens, so that you'll have a sense that there's a portent portentous comet which has been observed. Now, you could say, well, that's just something that anybody might talk about. But there has been some thought that it's more intensely interesting to Shakespeare, almost in a metaphysical way. So there he is reflecting this. John Donne, for example, who's writing in around 1600, 1605, at the turn where modern science, I would argue, begins with a kind of dramatic set of changes. That's the point. It had a long forehistory, long prehistory in the Middle Ages, going all the way back to the Greeks. But modern science begins very powerfully around 1600, a little bit after. John Donne immediately responds to the crisis that was produced by observations such as Galileo was making and others. He responds to this by saying that this new philosophy, as they called science, this new philosophy had put everything into doubt. Everything was now uncertain. There were new uncertainties. It was a crisis situation. And that's starting pretty early, around 1605, 1610. And yet it's, of course, difficult because the English had a powerful astronomical group of scientists who just briefly predate Galileo. So, Colin, I think it's always the case with history that we like a date, we can't quite see it. My favorite dramatic date is 1610, when Galileo, it is thought, he is the first person to take a telescope and turn it upwards and look into the sky. He had been using telescopes, as had others, for a while, but they were looking horizontally with them. So when we speak of 1610, we're talking about that moment in January of that year. It must have been very cold. He looked up to the sky in Florence, and he made the epical discovery of 4 tiny little planets going around Jupiter, which is, of course, one of the the greatest planets that he could observe. So no one had ever seen these before. And this shook the foundations of Western thought. And that's 1610. So that particular observation of his, he wrote up immediately, and it went like wildfire. He wrote it up in a little tract, a little treatise called The Celestial Messenger, and everybody read it almost instantly. The news of it was carried by the ambassador to London, so they knew very quickly that something new had happened. It was an exciting moment, and he was in correspondence very quickly with people like Kepler and so on. So I would like to say that the influence of science upon poetry and the converse influence of poetry and literature on science is one of the most delicate interactions we can study. That's really what this book is about. It's about the issue that I raise in the very first chapter, which I call Galileo's metaphor, and maybe we can talk about that.
I wanted to make sure to be clear about this.
Sure.
Contrast the new theory with the old ideas.
My favorite expositor of the old idea, which was medieval, and they went all the way back to Aristotle. Aristotle was the first person to codify the science of physics. He gave the name, we have the name of physics from Aristotle's Physics, and then he wrote the metaphysics about that book, that earlier book. But he goes back that far. But the medieval idea of motion, which is called the theory of impetus, and what it means is that somehow or other, for example, if you take a stone and you throw it, the question that they raised was, well, why does the stone move? You're obviously strong, your right arm is strong, your left arm is strong. You give it a throw, you give it a heave, and it leaves your hand and follows a trajectory until it hits the ground. Now, where did the force come from? How did it go? So they were puzzled. In effect, they thought that somehow or other, the energy to move passed from your hand into the stone. So somehow this force that moved the stone was an impetus. It was a shoving that got into the stone. And what interested them was this process of the entrance of the force into the stone and then how long it lasted and so on. Now, this put their emphasis on certain kinds of pushing and shoving that produced what they used to call violent motion. And they got interested in all the ways in which they thought this could happen. Feynman says that they had an idea that, generally speaking, these stones that we threw them, little angels got behind them and sort of pushed them. And then they would say, no, they didn't push them, they blew on them. So the breeze of their blowing on them pushed them. And they had all sorts of ideas trying to figure this out. Well, this produced a mindset which got concentrated on what I would call a kind of occult theory of what makes things move. Somehow, motion was very mysterious, and it remained very occult, like a mystery of some sort. In any case, along came Galileo, and he had been doing experiments. The famous experiment, of course, is his possibly apocryphal thing of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, in which the large cannonball and the small one reached the ground at the same time. So he started to try to figure out, well, why is that? And he found that you couldn't really observe things that were falling off towers. So he rolled them down an inclined plane. And then he observed that what counts with motion is not so much to explain this occult impetus or anything like it, but what is motion in itself? What does it look like when you actually measure it? And he found then, as Feynman says, and I think I quote him, well, look, if something is moving and there's nothing touching it at all, it's kind of got no friction to hold it up or anything, like a nicely finished inclined plane just sloping down perfectly. And this whatever this object is rolling down the plane and nothing's touching it, and it's completely undisturbed. The motion will go on forever. So in outer space, for example, in 2001, when HAL, the computer, cuts the lifeline of the other astronaut, and that astronaut is set free to just float forever through space, that poor astronaut who's suffocating, of course, is going to float forever in the same direction, in a straight line out forever, until perhaps he falls into the gravitational attraction of another planet, let's say. But the thing that changed Galileo's vision was that he saw what counts with motion is this straight line, unimpeded, frictionless, rectilinear track that motions take. And this, which sounds highly abstract and terribly simple, changed everybody's concerns towards a different vision of why movement, motion, and action is so central to all modern science, because it permitted scientists like Newton to come along and create what they called the laws of motion. Because now you could actually study not why do things move because they have occult impetus in them, but how do they move? The how becomes the central scientific question. Then, of course, for me, the thing is, well, did the poets lose something? What happened to the poets when this marvelous new science got rolling? And that's my concern, you see. My concern is to stay balanced between the claims and the needs of the arts, of poets, painters, musicians. Musicians are terribly important in all of this, to balance their claims, which are imaginative, against the claims, equally powerful, of the scientists, which are imaginative in conceptual terms, but are factual and instrumental and pragmatic in what we call experimental terms. And theoretical terms depend upon experiments, which are questions of fact in the sciences. Whereas in the poems of Shakespeare, in the poems of Wallace Stevens, in the poems of William Carlos Williams, or whoever it may be that we can think of, going all the way back to the ancient Greeks and to the Psalms of David, which are the first great poems that the Elizabethans knew. But if you go back to these poems, you realize that what proves a poem to be right is not its fitting some facts in nature, but rather that it fits the dream. It fits human imagination. It doesn't even fit that. It expresses it. And that's the mystery of the artist.
So there's no experimental test for a poem. It
It
fits the imagination or doesn't.
I'd love to ask you, what's your take on that?
It's something that you made me think about while reading the book. I mean, and we can frame it like this, of Galileo's discoveries taking away those little angels pushing stones that you throw. What did the removal of the angels take away, if anything, from what the artists were doing?
A very good question. Was there the powers of science grew very rapidly and exponentially, you could even say, so that by the end of the 17th century, modern science is in full swing on all fronts, including biological science, because in Shakespeare's day, Harvey discovered the circulation of the blood, for example. So we know that we're moving on all fronts. So this rapid advancement of science, which is what Francis Bacon called it when he theorized about what science had to be in Britain, well, that was accompanied, of course, by the fate of poetry, as you say. Now, what did they do? I think they tried to be clever about it in the first place if they were like John Donne. John Donne is often seems to be like an extremely clever analytical poet, but many of his best readers think that he was full of tricks of pseudo-logic, as if he were analyzing the new philosophy, which caused so much trouble, but not really. He was really just having fun with it, because he was, of course, a deep Christian mystic. We could say that, in one respect, the poets could not encounter science on its own ground as it developed. But what happened, I think, is this. The poets took what we would call the Zeitgeist, or the worldview. I often call it the manifold of interests of the sciences, which were all around them by now, mostly in the mode of discovery, discovering the new world, for example, all sorts of celestial bodies as telescopes were used, and so on. They took the impulse driving the new science, and they allowed it to infiltrate their poetic concerns. So, for example, Christopher Marlowe takes the idea that time is of tremendous concern in the sciences, and he says, I need a hero who is virtually persecuted by the sense of the shortage of time. And this hero turns out to be Dr. Faustus, who makes a deal with the devil so that he will have 24 years of completely unimpeded, powerful time to do what he wants, which is like the unimpeded motion, rectilinear motion, discovered by Galileo when objects are cast out into space. So this is the story of Dr. Faustus by Marlowe, and I call it simply the invention of the deadline, because the minute you have this acute sense of the material functions of time, which scientists are interested in, because, of course, time is a material phenomenon when you're measuring motion. The minute you've got this, you say, okay, there's a shortage of it. There's a quantity of time, and therefore there's a deadline. And in the Middle Ages, they didn't really have deadlines. There was no reason to think of something like a newspaper deadline, deadline for your show, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, you have a deadline, and we clock it. I talk with you, and we arrange, and we do this in all parts of our lives. The modern world is a world of virtually unconscious deadlines. One of the nice things about the observation of cell phones is that you can see people communicating mini deadlines all the time. I will be at the grocery store in 15 minutes. I'll pick up Johnny after school, and that'll be 4:30. And that's Marlovian. That's Christopher Marlowe in action as a poet. Then when you get to Shakespeare, it's more subtle, much more complicated, and there I get into the question of, well, what's the experience of this new time and space? And there it's a matter of crossing thresholds. And Shakespeare is this paramount master of threshold experiences. So I focus mostly on one particular play, which deliberately picks up the question of threshold, which is called Timon of Athens, which is a great tragedy of Shakespeare's. And this poor man, Timon, who's very rich, suddenly finds he's bankrupt. Again, a kind of deadline, which he didn't see coming. He simply didn't see coming. And at that moment, he says, somebody's got to defend the interim. I need space here. So this is an exploration of the way Shakespeare involves himself in one of the fundamental interests of the analysis of things in motion. If something's moving, it's crossing a perpetual door sill, a threshold, the limen, as it's called in anthropology. So this is the theory of liminality, we call it. And Shakespeare is full of endless uses like this. That's really what's happening in Hamlet. Hamlet, you know, is my perfect case, although I don't deal with it too much in this book, because the point of Hamlet, as we all know, is that he doesn't seem to be able to move.
Exactly, yes.
He is delayed. So there's Shakespeare dealing with these issues. And, of course, one of the things that's remarkable about Hamlet's predicament is that he's aware that he's living in the wrong space. There's something bad about the court of Denmark. There's something disturbed about this space. There's something rotten about it, he says. Something's falling apart here. So this is a spatial reduction of very much larger issues, philosophic issues, to one particular dramatic situation. Donne, of course, is, as I've said, is concerned with the large issues of uncertainty produced by the new science, which he writes about in various ways a lot. And then, of course, later, and Ben Jonson I'm fascinated by. I've always loved Ben Jonson, who wrote the greatest city comedies. Ben Jonson's the first author to write about noise pollution, for example. He has a great play called The Silent Woman, in which a trick is played upon this poor man, a businessman in London, who says the only thing I want in a wife is a wife who won't talk too much. So the people playing this trick on him, they get this young kid to dress up as his wife, and that's okay, except that when he's married to her, turns out does nothing but talk. And so, but he's really talking about the city of London. And the play that I concern myself with is called The Alchemist by Ben Jonson. It's one of the great comedies of all time. Coleridge, a great critic later, said it has the most perfect plot of any comedy ever written. The Alchemist is about alchemy and a bunch of con men who con these various people who want to get rich, they want to get famous, they want all sorts of instant gratifications through alchemy. So these two con men dress up as alchemists, and they cheat everybody blind. And the key to this is that, of course, the point of alchemy is that it's a desperate belief system according to which you can actually speed up time. So if you have a proper alchemist, he can actually speed up the production of gold, taking, let's say, bits of dirt. So alchemy involves the acceleration of time in the imagination. And it's an extraordinary kind of madness that overtakes people in a commercial society. And that's what Ben Jonson was constantly satirizing. And that was his great theme, was the desperate attempt to get rich quick and what it would do to you. So he's very modern, but it's curious that he's dealing with this idea centrally through the alchemical belief that you can accelerate even the passage of time. So it's a long way away from St. Augustine's great meditations on time in his Confessions with Ben Jonson. And so I go on like this, and then, of course, I finally get to the greatest English epic, though it's got some competition. Paradise Lost deliberately picks up all these great scientific issues because it's a poem of space travel. It's a poem in which space, time, and motion are central. It's a poem in which Galileo is mentioned 3 times, very rare event in an abstract poem, because Milton knew that he had seen with his telescope the vast motions of our celestial universe, which in medieval times had been fixed. After all, medieval philosophy attempted to keep the Earth at the center of our universe. As soon as Copernicus came along and said, no, we can finally show the sun is the center, then the theory of general motion changed, and Milton picks up on this. He's fascinated by it. And he basically introduces what we would call the theory of relative motion. You could argue that relativity is apparent in that poem all the way through. Einstein says this directly. He says that his theory of relativity is based in its earliest stages on what's called Galilean relativity, which is that everything in the universe is moving in relation to everything else. Now, this was not possible for the people in the Middle Ages to understand very easily. They couldn't have thought that because it was too disturbing. But, of course, we know we have the laws of gravity, so we don't worry. we realize it's all moving, but it's got a perfect order of motion. It's very complicated, but it's still constellated in a very beautiful way. So there is, finally, in this book, what I'm trying to show in this book is that the best form of stability is the stability of moving objects in an orderly way. That's what I'm trying to show. And the poets had always intuitively sensed this. They'd always thought this anyway, because if you write a good poem, it's got to all work together, but all the parts are moving in relation to every other part. Actually, a poem is like a marvelous metaphysical machine.
It has a wrought structure in the same sort of way?
I think so.
One of the issues that will come to the mind of a modern reader is they'll wonder how time, space, and motion were dealt with before this new theory. In medieval drama and medieval poetry, were these just ignored, or were they treated in a way that would, of course, be alien to a modern reader?
It's a very rich question. I think we could say, well, for example, there is a tendency in modern literature, in the modern world, to localize spatial relations. So a play in the Elizabethan period in the 17th century and today, even to this day, until you get to very, very modern poets, I use the word poet to mean any of the creative artists virtually of any kind, but strictly speaking, authors like Beckett, for example, he will locate a play like Endgame in a place which is impossible to localize. It's not London or Paris. It's not even the Sahara Desert. It might be a little bit of all three. Or it might be the prison yard outside of the apartment where Beckett lived. I mean, it could be anywhere. It's not specified. Now, the specification was often not very clear, I think, in medieval poetry. In the Romance of the Rose, for example, the great narrative allegory, the rose garden, which is the center of love in the universe, is a kind of ideal symbol of the center, as we call it. It's a very ancient, timeless, you might say, it's a place which doesn't have any geographical position. That, I think, would be not always true for medieval literature. After all, Chaucer has a version of the story of the Trojan War, Troilus and Cressida, and it's related to the Trojan War. But then we think of the Trojan War as somehow vaguely occurring somewhere over there in ancient Greece somewhere.
No specificity.
Not really, not very specified. I think that would be true of time. Time is also, in a curious way, made universal in a religious sense. For example, in Everyman, the great morality play, every man wants someone to go with him because he is told he is going to die. He doesn't want to die alone, and he doesn't want to take the journey into the next world all alone. But while the people that he speaks with are very sort of graphic persons of the world in which such an ordinary man might live, they're not given professions with the detail that you'd expect, and every man's condition is almost made universal without regard to observational, a kind of experimental attitude. It's not as if you said, look, is a cubic centimeter of sodium going to weigh the same thing in China as it does in New York, which is a question of specificity. You just get rid of that. Say, the literature I know best, which is English literature in the Middle Ages, you don't feel this compulsion to introduce clear history in a scientific sense, which, of course, is another development which is occurring during the period I write about. That is, this is a period of the rise of modern historiography, beginnings of acute investigation into the actual sources of our historical information. Now, that's the kind of thing that changes people's idea of, well, how would you tell a story? In the old days, in the Middle Ages, I'm saying, the usual ground for believing that a story was true was that you found it in some old book. You didn't really investigate to see whether it was true or not.
You just read it.
You just read it, and the book had authority, and this was supported profoundly by the book of books, namely the Bible. The problem of natural science was that it also got turned into a book problem. So they spoke of the book of nature. It's a great metaphor, but it has a tendency to I guess you'd have to say, to remove some of the pragmatic grit from the problems of the scientist, of course. And I don't want to diminish. I mean, there's been a lot of work done to show how medieval scientists were working very hard to work out what the directions should be. That's not the issue here. They needed to make further changes. Instruments were not adequate for what they wanted, for example, like telescopes, thermometers, and so on. In any case, the poets of the earlier period had, I suppose you could put it this way, Colin, they did not have the theory of perspective.
No theory of perspective.
I think not. I think if you look at great medieval painting, you see that the paintings of the period lack the geometrical perspective which arises in the Renaissance and then thereafter controls the rendering of space, and therefore any movement within space, according to geometry. That's really missing in medieval painting. So there's no real need to watch the way in which objects in a pictorial space seem to violate what we can see a camera would see, and why couldn't they see it? Well, they didn't.
It seems like just another dimension of the lack of specificity. It's what I'm hearing as a huge theme of the medieval poetry. Specificity is not there.
The minute we try to put this into the most abstract terms, we run into trouble. The readers of, say, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales will remember with a kind of delight the way in which, in some way, the pilgrims on their way to Canterbury are very specifically described in little touches of dress or manner or appearance, their faces or whatever it may be, their rank in society. But it is not, I guess the way to put it is this: specificity that begins to change into modern science and literature and art is a specificity resulting from new ideas about the marriage of theory and instruments of observation. So that the specificity that marks modern science is always marked by an extraordinary degree of sophisticated instrumentation. The only way you can do quantum mechanics is to have amazing machinery of observing particle physics. It's just extraordinary what can be done today with spectroscopy and so on. It's a long way before we reach that, in Shakespeare's day even. But the beginnings occur of this marriage between theory. It's got to be this way, says Galileo, because I notice when I'm in the lagoon in Venice, these things are happening right in front of me. I've got to have a theory, a geometry, which I can then test out with observations. But in order to test them with observations, I've got to have good instruments. Interaction of instrument and theory seems to be the modern note, the modern condition of thought. And it does inspire the poet. See, I argue that in spite of the abstractness of the new science in many ways, that the primacy and the paramount importance of the theory of motion, which is really revolutionary, what this does is it inspires the poets. Now it gives them a new task, a new challenge. And I would argue that it inspired Milton to create the greatest poem in our language in epic form. He's rivaled by Shakespeare, of course, and two or three other authors. But he's inspired by the idea of space travel, and Paradise Lost is a world of space travel. I mean, Satan just zooms around in the universe. It's quite marvelous. True. I mean, it's an amazing piece of it. I mentioned 2001. I mean, Kubrick would be delighted. In fact, I'm trying to remember whether there's a plan that Harold Bloom, the great critic, was going to do a space travel opera based on Paradise Lost. I think that didn't work out for some reason, but the idea is correct.
That's something I would have liked to have seen.
Oh, yes, it would have been great. Oh, yes, it would have been marvelous. Yeah.
The interplay here between poetry and science, how did the poets in turn affect science?
Take a scientist, Galileo, he wrote actually on Italian romantic epics, Ariosto and Tasso. He actually wrote a treatise on this. So he was interested in Ariosto, and he praised him above the more conservative and very marvelous Italian epic poet Tasso, Torquato Tasso. But Ariosto is interesting because he, too, is a poet of space travel. And curiously, he's full of strange time warps and weird naturalistic extensions beyond the usual possibilities of moving around and being settled and knowing where you are and knowing how much time has passed and how fast you're moving. Ariosto is the man of kind of supreme digression when you don't expect it. I think this is important for Galileo because he kept very free. His great trick was to stay free of all interference with what he thought he should simply report on. Galileo was a very brave but also very canny person. He realized he had troubles with the church. You have to remember that Giordano Bruno, who believed in the multiplicity of universes among many strange things, which we can almost believe in today, of course, he was put to death by the Inquisition. Galileo never forgot that. This is a complicated story which has been much written about. Galileo's trial equally. Galileo was, however, a person who thought, if I don't maintain decent relationships with the church, by the way, many Catholic astronomers supported him, and many Catholic members of the church of high rank supported Galileo. So it was a quarrelsome, tendentious period in Galileo's life. I'm going on about Galileo, but the point about Galileo is that his sense of the world was conditioned by the arts, I am certain, very strongly. He himself was a tremendous musician. They say that until his last days, he was an expert lute player. And we all know that lute playing, it's the most difficult stringed instrument to play. So you don't play the lute because you just like the sound musical. You really have to be a good musician to play it.
Yeah.
You know, that kind of thing. Now, there's an area influencing the sciences in a large way. The way I would put it, Colin, is this. The sciences will often pretend they have no interest in the arts for understandable reasons. I mean, for example, I mentioned Richard Feynman, a very great scientist. I don't think he would have been too happy to think that he was being influenced much by the fact that he was interested in painting and so on. But, you know, I think the thing, though, is that the sciences are influenced by the general cultural support that is coming from poets. By poets, again, I mean writers of all kinds, including historians, philosophers, lyric poets, dramatists, movie writers. You know, part of the poetry today is movies and so on. Whatever the form of imaginative art, the scientists gain by the sympathy and the use of, or not the use precisely, but the sympathetic manifold created on a much larger plane by the artist. That's how I look at it. I mean, it isn't a matter of technical knowledge. I mean, Thomas Pynchon has technical knowledge of relativity theory. That's not quite the thing that would comfort a relativity theorist today, although relativity theory is fairly much kind of settled nowadays. But say quantum mechanics. I mean, the scientists in quantum mechanics are working with such technically difficult stuff and very weird stuff that what helps them is to have an atmosphere in which weird things are understood to be culturally important, where entanglement is the norm. I mean, that's what's going on in quantum mechanics at the very time we speak. You have to have an atmosphere of openness to have proper science. It has to be an open society for science to proceed, and that is the main interest of all the imaginative poets, artists, musicians, and so on. Right down the line. Their interest in the arts is, in my view, one of the great bulwarks against intolerance and ignorance, even though they're they're not looking for facts exactly. They're looking for the grounds of open thinking. And of course, they're very formal, so they don't mean just any old thinking. They're always trying to get the story to work right,
Yeah.
See what I mean? I mean, I'm not saying something that's really mysterious here. I'm a big fan of trying to get across that we are in dire need for supporting the arts in general because they're a serious mode of thinking about our society.
You're applying this to the modern day.
Yes. I tend to have a kind of what I call systematic anachronism. I don't mind bouncing back and forth between periods, our times, modern times today, going back to the Middle Ages, as you did just a few minutes ago. I think this is the right way to do it. So suddenly, if you said, "Well, would this be like the time in ancient Athens when Sophocles wrote Oedipus Rex?" I would say, that's an interesting question, and we'd look at it, you see. So we'd use a systematic jumping back and forth across time, being very careful that when we draw these likenesses, we keep all the factors in mind. The problems that beset, for example, an excessively literal reading of the Bible, for example, would never occur if the readers were clearly of the Bible were clearly instructed that they are reading verbal constructs, things that were written down finally by someone, and these are always ambiguous, always. They've never been otherwise. That's the beauty of it. And we are being trained in learning how to deal with an ambiguous universe. That's what our job is. Otherwise, nobody were worried about anything. There wouldn't be any trade deficit, I'll tell you that.
The danger is to assume no ambiguity when there is ambiguity, then.
Yes, I think so.
The ideas in this book, how do they fit into your career as a whole?
I began my career by writing a general theory of symbolism in the mode of allegorical expression. Now, allegorical expression, which use icons, logos, talismans, all sorts of unchanging pictures, which have what you call it, permanent, defined meanings, and then these are strung out into vast works like the Divine Comedy of Dante or Pilgrim's Progress and so on. I began by writing about that, and of course it's a very generalized modality of human thought. Allegory is just everywhere. It's what, for example, selling in a mass market depends upon. And this appears in politics. So I work with that, and that's actually a theory of symbolic technique in which you try to keep the symbolism from changing. You try to keep it fixed. Then I moved on to writing about prophecy in the poetry of Spenser's predecessor, Edmund Spenser, in his epic, The Faerie Queen. And there I developed a whole theory of prophecy based on this idea of liminality that I mentioned. And I've written a book about an early poem, a little drama of Milton's. I've written general essays in theory of literature and language. And actually, recently, I've realized that my concerns have always been in what you might call the philosophy of literature. It's not a field which has been explored, and many people have called things theorizing, which I don't consider theorizing. They're just commenting in a kind of continuous and impetuous way about something that fascinates me. That's not theory. Theory is a bit the way it is in science. You say something and you guarantee to predict something else will happen. And that's how I've always understood theory. And then I've written numbers of specialized essays of different kinds about poets and certain other kinds of thinkers. Herodotus, the ancient historian, Vico, the founder of modern anthropological thought, stuff like that. But then not so long ago, I was asked to lecture on Walt Whitman at the English Institute at Harvard, and I did that, and I was very moved by reading Whitman again, and that led me to write the book that you referred to, A New Theory for American Poetry, which describes that aspect of our poetry, which, loosely speaking, is kind of descriptive in a certain way. We really like Walt Whitman. We want to say, well, what's out there? What's happening on Broadway? What's it like in the evening as the sun sets on the East River and you watch the movement of the water and the lights reflected off the water in crossing Brooklyn Ferry, for example. So I became just again delighted by Walt Whitman, and this book of mine comes out of that book because in the new theory I emphasize two things: the importance of environment, environmental change, and also, I guess you'd say, I was emphasizing the changes which involve all sorts of democratic process, because we have an unusual experiment in this country, all of which involve a radical change from old Europe, as Walt Whitman saw. He kept calling Europe, which wasn't true anymore, he kept calling it feudal, the feudal system, just because there was still a king of England, let's say, or there was a king of Denmark. And so I found myself in the New Theory book, which is, of course, the title is drawn from Whitman himself, who says we need a new theory. He himself said this. And that's a book about John Ashbery, whose poetry I admire enormously, which has connections to Whitman's poetry. That book introduced me to the more fundamental question, well, what is the basis of this change which makes for the life force in living environments? What kinds of changes are there? But then I thought, well, what on earth is change? And then I went right back to the origins, and I went right back to Aristotle's physics and metaphysics, and lo and behold, with the ancient Greek philosophers, it all starts because they say change simply is a form of motion. All change is a kind of movement. When it's translated into human affairs, we call it action. So if I take an action, I move. And if I move, I'm actually changing my time for a moment, my space for a moment. And then those times and spaces become part of me, whether it's in my thoughts or if I actually reach over and pick up a cup of coffee, let's say. See, the coffee changes me if I have some in the morning, but I have to move to get the change to happen. It's a kind of like Alfred North Whitehead, it's a kind of complicated meditation I now see on the way in which process enters art and literature and life. And actually, the subtitle of the New Theory book just invokes the idea of the future of imagination. Because, of course, if we squelch, if we repress imaginative activities in any way, we have to be very careful, because we're actually trying to repress normal human motility, the powers of movement, hence the powers, not changing things just for the sake of it, but changing in order to acquire a new form of stability. I mean, we all know today, for example, the computer revolution is changing our whole condition of life as we speak instantly in a colossal way. So it's up to us to understand change in a very fundamental sense. So that's kind of what I apparently have always been interested in, moving from that early book, which said, what about stable imagery, and gradually becoming more and more open to the question of destabilizing the image, going away from allegory towards symbolism and towards a kind of Shakespearean vision, say, a Miltonic vision. John Donne, Ben Jonson, Christopher Marlowe, Andrew Marvell, who, after all, he's trying, to his coy mistress, he's trying to seduce the lady. Okay? So what does he begin by? He begins with this theme that I'm talking about. Had we but world enough and time, this dear lady, your coyness wouldn't be a crime. But we're short of time and space. So what do? We roll all our strength and all our sweetness, he says, into one ball, and we will chase time. That's what that poem says. It's an extraordinary invocation of all these attributes that science is concerned with.
The bringing together, or the pre-existing convergence of science and the humanities, this is something that has, you think, A big future?
Colin, that's very important. It's a critical question. I think and I hope that this will be the case, that we will examine and promote this convergence. We have to do it. We need this. We need to ask, how does technology affect us in ways that involve the way we imagine the world, which is part of the humanities, as we call it. I mean, I've been around long enough to remember when we just, without questioning, we just understood that the freeing, the freedom, the liberalization, I don't mean anything political by this, I mean the general and fundamental liberality, freeing up of the mind through humanistic study has to involve an equal concern for what is technology doing, what is science, what are the other areas that we're not yet aware of. We've got to be ready for changes that require us to always interject a kind of human dimension. That's my feeling. I think the question you're raising is a critical one. I'm afraid too much today, because of economics. The universities, as has been pointed out, are perilously close to becoming commercial enterprises, both for the students, whose parents seem to think they're going there in order to make a good living, which I hope they will, but that's not the purpose. The purpose is to make you a different person so that when you make a good living, you'll do it right. That's my feeling, see? But that means do it right with a few different dimensions all intersecting. That's my sense of it. We've got to do this that you're suggesting. We've got to do this. Absolutely.
It's the only way for the humanities to move forward?
I think so, because the humanities have to absolutely not just, it doesn't do you much good in a court of law, I guess, to deny that you did the crime, You got to show that you didn't do it. Somebody's got to help you show the thing. And the proof of this matter is that the humanities are, in fact, the forefront, if we can only see it, of intellectual independence. Because the point about Sir Philip Sidney said it very beautifully a long time ago. He said, you can't accuse a poet of telling lies because he never affirms anything anyway. He does, the poet nothing affirmeth. And then what did he say? He said, the poet ranges within the zodiac of his own wit. Namely, he's a guy who says, she's a woman who says, let me propose to you these thoughts. Think about them. Entertain them. Let them change your outlook. Now, in many technological spheres, the technology is so demanding that you have to narrow your gaze. You've got to narrow it down because you can't do it otherwise. And this is the difficulty. We need highly trained, opening out visions. And that's why it's not because I'm a professor of literature. That's not it. It's just something, because after all, I taught at Caltech, and I would have stayed there if it hadn't been for family reasons. I loved Caltech, okay? It was wonderful, talking to Max Delbruck and Murray Gell-Mann and whoever. That's wonderful, and my students were spectacular. They were all scientists. It's not that. It's the interaction that I want. Now, how do we do it? I'm not sure. I'm hoping that this year I'm the Getty Research Professor at the Getty Center in Los Angeles. I'm hoping that good things can come from places like the Santa Fe Institute. I have studied complexity theory with some of those people, and I've used it in my criticism. In fact, of Elizabethans, I've used it. I published an article a little while ago about how you could apply complexity theory to Edmund Spencer's cantos of mutability.
I like that.
See? So it goes this way pretty much for me.
Are you optimistic about the future, then, of this convergence?
Well, I guess in a curious way I am. Yeah, the optimism question is a tough one, isn't it?
Yes.
I suppose I have what you might call a certain limited optimism, but I also think I should have more because that's the right attitude. And when I speak with my students, they all want it, especially the younger ones. They all sense a need for these convergences. Now, if we put too much pressure on people to acquire knowledge too quickly, it's harder for them to do that. After all, we need to really know what we're talking about. If I'm talking about John Donne, I have to read an actual poem or two that he wrote.
Sure.
Or if I'm going to talk about Dr. Johnson's criticism, or if I want to say something about, even as a complete amateur, if I want to say something about, say, relativity theory, it behooves me to read Einstein's short little book introducing his own theory to us, to lay people. But I've got to read it. I've got to contact it. I've got to immerse myself. I don't know. I think I'm optimistic, but I do fear galloping technology in the pretense that it will solve our problems. I'm afraid of that because it doesn't have perspective. Remember, I was saying before, perspective was one of the great discoveries of the Renaissance.
Exactly.
I believe that to be true. Any time there's a kind of clamping down on discovery voyages, on looking a little bit over the edge of the world just to see if it is really round, which we believe it to be. Anytime somebody's willing to do what Columbus did, I'm in favor of that, you see. And I was fascinated. I was just looking at a little passage in my Time, Space, and Motion book, and I reminded myself, I'd forgotten this, that one of the travelers, Harriet, who went to Virginia on a Virginian exploratory voyage at the end of the 16th century, he took a telescope with him. It's interesting. So what I'm always saying is you got to keep looking. And that, I think, is where my optimism lies. I mean, just right now at the Getty, for example, in a few days from now, some of the scholars, quite a large number, are holding a 2-day, very sort of marathon kind of analysis of what they think about their own field of art history. So, this is a tremendously important thing because they're actually engaged fully with the history of many kinds of different works of art, all sorts. But they also are looking at, okay, how do we relate to the current situation in the world at large? That, I think, is splendid. See, it isn't as if we're contemplating our navels. We're not doing that. We're looking outwards as we know our special needs. It's that kind of thing.
It's the need to always enter into exploratory ventures that you find important.
That's a good way to put it. Exploratory ventures. There's a kind of built-in independence in most real exploration. There's always a yearning to take a chance this way, and I'm all for that.
The book, once again, is Time, Space, and Motion in the Age of Shakespeare. Angus Fletcher, thank you so much for taking the time to come on.
Thank you, Colin. Thanks very much.
Our music is composed by Ben Althouse. He also goes under the names Ice Ben and DJ Concept. Check out his website, www.benalthouse, that's BENALTHOUSE.com. For more information and our online show archive, visit colinmarshallradio.com.